So, welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. I am truly thrilled to have our guest speaker today, Dr. Claudia Rankins, here. So, most of you know that I focus my work on Black representation in the science curriculum. And Dr. Claudia Rankins is the first white person I've had here on my show. And so, maybe you're asking, well, why? Why have her here? So, first of all, before I even tell you the why when it comes to our topic, I want to say that most people don't know that Dr. Claudia Rankins has been so instrumental in helping me with the work and forward the work that I've done. And so who knows, maybe one day we'll talk about it. And I know, Dr. Rankins, I didn't tell you this, but there are moments when I felt like you really got my vision compared to most people I know. And so today, our topic, we're going to talk about mothers' perspectives on raising and educating biracial Black boys. And I want to say that, I'm truly excited to, learn from you today as well. And, for us to discuss and share perspectives, because I think a lot of times when we have mixed families, it gives us such a perspective and such a contrast, not only with what we're seeing in society, but also in our personal lives that allows us to see the connections between both that maybe someone with a contrast may not. So, Dr. Rankins, welcome today. And before we got started, I say let's talk a little bit about yourself in context. Most people know you for your role at NSF, but just give a little bit about your background, and then you can give a little bit, some about your background related to our topic today. Welcome.
Okay. And I don't want to make this too long, but I actually grew up in Germany and then moved to this country after I got married in 1975 and earned all of my degrees here. So my bachelor's, master's, PhD. I taught math and physics for many years at Hampton University. I also was an administrator there, dean, department chair, and then sort of decided that I wanted to have maybe an impact on HBCUs on a more national scale. When this job at the National Science Foundation leading the HBCU undergraduate program opened up, I applied for it and was accepted. And I did that for 12 years, awarding over $400 million in research grants to HBCU faculty. That was like the highlight of my life, really.
Awesome.
Then I retired a few years ago, and I sort of work with HBCU faculty still, but behind the scenes, helping them prepare competitive proposals.
Awesome. As I was thinking about this, I forgot we also worked years after in the new HBCU center, but we'll save that for an HBCU conversation. So, talk about being a mother. I know that when we started talking about this, we started talking about ways of even talking about things and language. So, can you just describe, if you can just describe your experience just being a mother and even thinking about considerations or things you might have had to think about that, another white mother might not. But if you can give us some background, that'd be a good place to start.
Well, I almost sort of want to put it in a little bit of a historical context here. I came to this country in 1975. We lived for 1 year in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. My husband and I could not go out together. Like, we could not go to restaurants together. We could not be seen in public together. Even though interracial marriages were legal, they were frowned upon very much so. So we were constantly stuck by the police and so forth. We moved to Hampton, Virginia a year later in 76, and it was a little bit better there because there's like a large military presence there. And so interracial marriages are were more frequently seen.
Okay.
But it still was not like widely accepted like it is today. So when my son was born in 1977, it was even clear to me after some of the things I had experienced that I was completely oblivious about moving here from Germany. You know, the open hostilities and all. It sort of became really clear to me that we had to raise him with one identity, the identity that he was seen as in this country. He was seen as being Black. Even if you have one drop of Black blood in you, that's how you're being seen at. So we sort of made that decision that we would raise him that way to hopefully make it a little bit easier on him by having this identity to belong to this group.
Hmm.
Most of his family, at least here in the United States, is Black. My family in Germany originally was not very, this is like an understatement, very accepting of the marriage. They sort of came around a little bit after he was born, but, um, they were certainly not as close to him as my husband's family and friends and my friends were here. So, yeah, other than that, I guess, sometimes I hear people say that when you raise your child, there's a Black parent, a white parent, a parent of Asian descent, a Black parent, whatever it may be, you raise him in one race, it diminishes the culture and the history of the other parent, which I don't think it's true. It doesn't diminish it at all. It's just that we felt he had to know who he was first before he could accept all of who he was.
Absolutely. Wow. It's funny. I remember we had this conversation a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember my reaction when you mentioned that, yeah, you raised him as Black. And I mentioned something to you. I don't know if you remember that even though I agree with you. My thought was I'd really resented the fact that other people were defining, right, his identity and what it was, right? And so, but just to speak to what you said, yes, wow. So I guess it makes sense that some people might think you're diminishing, but the more I chose to make sure, our son really understood his Black identity, because I understood that was what, even without words, that was being diminished. Because we're not just, we are living in a social, in a cultural context, right? And so everything about this country, everything about a lot of the world highlights and elevates, right, white culture and diminishes Black culture, and sometimes elevates at the cost of diminishing Black culture without hesitation. So I really switched gears as our son. I shouldn't say switch gears. I've made an effort since he was small, even making an effort to make sure, when we go on vacation, when we, family gatherings, that he had that opportunity, and we were, and I should say I was fortunate that, I married into a family that was very open and accepting. And, you know, it wasn't something I thought about or worried about. But my son initially did go to a private school. And so, there were things I felt I really had to consider in educating him, and even looking at the way he saw himself. It was clear to me that the implicit ramifications of not being explicit, about raising him to understand his Black identity, I really needed to address it.
Yeah, so my son too went to elementary school, to a private school. He went to, it was called a lab school on the campus of Hampton University. And, you know, it is there where he learned the Black national anthem and things he would not have learned in public school. They celebrated Martin Luther King's holiday before it became a national holiday. Even at the time, I couldn't really afford that. I felt it was important that he was in this space. He had Black teachers who cared for him. Because on the opposite end, after he finished elementary school and I sent him to public middle school, he was tested for this, they called it back then the gifted program. And I was told when we walked into the room where he was being tested that I shouldn't even waste my time having him tested, because obviously he would not be doing well in this environment. So, yeah, so things,
Ridiculous.
this was a much earlier time. Things
Hmm.
changed a little bit and we sort of almost like fell for it maybe 20 or so years ago, that we're living in this post-racial world and that it would be okay for our children to be whoever they wanted to be and they would be accepted. But I think we're learning the hard way again how it really is, right?
Yeah, things have changed in terms of how they might be perceived, but there's so much of the essence of what you experience, still there now. But it's often experienced in very subtle ways. And I found that I really needed a lot of help unpacking what I was experiencing, right? Because you knew, okay, certain things weren't making sense. Even by looking to see, and this is how it shows up. It shows up differently now. People aren't necessarily blatantly and outwardly putting your son down, but it's more, there's a lack of encouragement, right? There might be things said where, oh, that person can be a leader, but not necessarily your son, or, things like that. So it's a little bit more subtle, I think, but more in the form of, it's more passive aggressive, I would say. Like we wouldn't do anything. We'll leave him to his own devices or we'll mold him in a way to be as mediocre as possible. Or, or leave the child alone kind of thing. And
Which
so
is
that's
worse in many ways than the
Mhm.
open racism, right? Because it creeps up on you, and if you're not aware of it, it might almost be too late. I mean, you're likely very perceptive, but this is your area of research and expertise, but not all parents have that
Yeah.
awareness.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true. It really does creep up in you, and it really, which is why I completely took him out of school and decided to homeschool him for the remainder of elementary school because I felt like I needed to undo some things. And, keeping him home was very revealing. I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from his character just to get him to, where I needed him to be. And I think the biggest lesson for me was also seeing that I couldn't influence his character as much if he spent most of his time with other people who thought a certain way.
Mhm.
And so that was the biggest thing because you need to be there when things that may seem unimportant come up, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
But I'm curious, even though I guess because your experience is so blatant, and it's funny as we were talking about, I was like, yeah, I didn't, I almost forgot that, your experience would be blatant and outwardly so than mine. But what other considerations did you have to think about in terms of, education um, you know, or think about in terms of educational considerations.
Definitely to be involved at every step and to be aware of these things. And I go back to that example when he finally made it to middle school and he was accepted in the gifted program. I went to the first parent teacher conference and the teacher said, "Does your son speak? Does he know how to speak?" And I said, "Have you ever asked him a question?" And she said, "No, he sits there and does his work, and he always does his work really well, but he never speaks." I said, "Well, try asking him questions and getting him engaged."
Mhm,
You know, we're talking here about like a 10-year-old
mhm,
in this environment, new environment. He's always been with all Black children in all Black teachers in an all Black school. He's now in this so-called gifted program. The children and all the teachers were white. So she actually, we ended up being good friends, the teacher and I. She started talking to him, and the next time we spoke, she said, "Wow, not only does he speak, but he really has something to say." But had I not gone to that parent teacher conference, right, and had this conversation with him, who knows what would have happened to him?
yeah. Yeah, I
I mean,
mean
because even later in high school, where he was a straight A student and he was in all of the AP courses and advanced courses, he got a B in his English class because the teacher said he never spoke. So we had to have that same conversation, right?
yeah.
Did you ever speak to him?
Mm, well, it's interesting because, you know, I guess I've done a lot of with our son, I've done a lot of intentional parenting for that reason too. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start with this. Knowing and my expectations of everybody's thinking. What I did was I took him out of the elementary school. I put him in after school, like Russian School of Math. I put him in Kumon, in addition to the work I've done just to get him thinking a certain way, you know. And what I remember when he was in the private school, things had happened, but I was purposely trying to approach it where to almost to encourage him to he would talk to me about little things that happened in school. He was fairly open and I would, give him some suggestions about how to respond. In some ways, being careful not to necessarily go into the school just yet. So I haven't actually had to do that. And mainly because I was concerned about him being targeted. And lo and behold, we did have an incident where he was in a situation where he wasn't really being challenged. And the teacher's
Mm.
approach to challenging him was, "Oh, I'm only giving you this extra work because your mom told me to do that." Yeah. And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to take him out and work with him at home. But what I didn't realize that came up later was I didn't realize that sometimes um, and I noticed from comments he made, like when he was in the playground, I think he felt like he needed to protect himself, right? Like he felt like this us and them. Well, they will come and la la la, and they will, XYZ. I'm curious as to what kind of conversations maybe came up for you and your son that he might have expressed that, you know, hey, it might have even changed the way you thought or surprised you.
Well, something that comes to mind, because in addition to, of course, the white teachers and the white students, also oftentimes, mixed race children may not be fully seen as Black by the other Black students
Mm-hmm.
or their peers.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't sort of know that my son, for the 4 years in high school, that he rode the bus with the neighborhood kids, never let them know he was like in these advanced courses or,
Yeah.
he was going to be maybe, he ended up being the salutatorian of his class. They were all like floored when he got up and gave the speech like, oh, we didn't know you were smart. But he really always like tried in some way to fit in
Mm,
uh, with all of the kids in the neighborhood. I'm not sure if that was to protect himself or to be one of them, to be accepted more.
mm-hmm.
He didn't talk about that much.
Hmm.
But the two close friends he had were also, in all of the classes with him. They both now also have PhDs and are successful.
Nice.
So he did find some friends, but I know it was hard for him. And I
Mm-hmm.
never knew if that was because he was sort of a quiet kid or because, the fact that he maybe didn't always completely fit into either
Yeah.
group of students. He
Wow.
also wasn't athletic, so that didn't help him at all.
Mm-hmm. I understand. I completely understand. Oh my goodness.
But we didn't really, thinking back, have a lot of those conversations about sort of how things went in school.
Okay.
Yeah, he just sort of went. He did really well in school. I supported him with, activities, sometimes pushed him into things he probably didn't want to do, like all of the science fair projects. I made him come on the campus of Hampton University every summer. I remember he was maybe like in 5th grade, and I made him sit in on some summer remedial. Back then we had
Mm-hmm.
classes, remedial math classes for students who couldn't quite start with pre-calculus. I made him sit in and take that class, and I think he enjoyed that very much. So yeah, you're making me think of like parental missteps now more than maybe what I did successfully.
Well, I did something, well, so kind of sort of similar when we I didn't have the luxury. He didn't have the luxury of, being in a private elementary school, right? Like your son was in Hampton. So what I did when I homeschooled him, I would take him to campus with me and he would sit in my office. And a lot of coincidences happened where when he was in a summer camp, he met a and bonded with a Howard student.
Mhm.
So then we got to talking, and I say, "Hey, you want a tutor?" And so, the kid would tutor him in art. Kid was in a art department, and so or he actually, or he would just, I what I did was I made use of the opportunity to provide a service to homeschoolers. And since I was preparing teachers and, this I wasn't happy with the sciences they got to observe. Like I used to take them, they used to go to field trips to my son private school and when he was not there, what I did was I just taught the middle homeschoolers myself. And so they got to come on campus. My students got to observe me teaching science. And so he got to interact, with my affiliation with Black homeschoolers. And so that was part of what I did. But it's also funny because, they get to understand technology too. So at one point, he was helping one of the lab folks to set up their VR goggles, because he could figure things out. But yeah, it did take a lot. For me, it took extra creativity trying to figure out what type of books to read to him to help him to um identify. And I have a slightly different situation too where his father, because his father is white versus your son's father. And for your son, they model fathers. So we had a lot of conversations about, with his dad about, okay, but you can do that, but he can't do that. And so, and things like that. We've had to have a different conversation and even figuring out where I was purposeful even about putting him, like he had some coaches. He had a Black basketball coach, people he can interact with. So in addition to my family, so he can just get to know them as well.
Yeah, when my son was little, there were really no books, like
Mm,
children's books for Black
yeah.
children. There weren't even this wasn't even a time when each doll came in black and in white. They were just the white dolls. And I remember
Wow.
my husband was so upset over the lack of diversity in Christmas ornaments
Mm,
that he just took like a black magic marker to the little angels that my mother had sent to put on the tree.
mhm,
We bring those out every Christmas in my husband's honor. I kept
mhm,
those to just, show his son.
mhm,
Angels don't necessarily have to be white. But so in the absence of books, I, tried to read sort of neutral books to him, like books about cars and books about,
mhm. Yeah.
whatever, not so much about people. And then, we taught him Black culture and history from early on, just so he was well versed in that.
Mhm,
But you couldn't buy like a little book about Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King
mhm.
or Malcolm X, but we could tell him who they were.
Yeah. Wow, those books were helpful.
And then I remember when my son loved Star Wars when it came out. He must have seen that first Star Wars movie, the first one that came out. I think he saw it. This was HBO at the time, like 23 times and knew the whole dialogue. So of course he wanted the little action figures, but then we always had to leave their helmets on because if his dad saw that he was playing with little white action figures, he would have probably taken them away. So Luke Skywalker always had a Darth Vader's helmet or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
It's
there was. Things have changed for the better in that regard. At least we can make sure that there is material and there are toys
mhm,
for everyone to play with.
absolutely. So going back to, decision making, because I'm sure, someone hearing you say that he doesn't want him to play with a white toy might think that in terms of why not, right? So going back to talk about identity, because I can say that the one of the things I've learned, okay, so this is a perfect example. I actually wrote about this in my book. One of the perfect example that came up was, when I go through the books with him, the different books, Martin Luther King and different people. And then the type of questions he asked really helped me to understand how negatively society's and unspoken negative perceptions, stereotypes of Black people were taking hold. And so I wanted to share that because, just to let people know, that's really a big concern. The unspoken is so powerful and so saturated, right? But it makes up 99.99% of what you encounter. And go ahead.
And plus, everything around him at the time was the white world, everything on TV. This was the time of the Dukes of Hazzard. I don't know if you remember that show. It was like this horrible TV show about these Southerners and this fast car. And the car had a rebel flag on top.
Mhm. Yeah,
But that was sort of what was on TV, and he loved cars. So, I mean, we let him watch that show,
I know.
and in school, in all of the textbooks, everybody was white. Everything was, so at least at home, my husband felt he should have he shouldn't play with, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, we let him have Luke Skywalker, but that was not the only one. We didn't buy like white action figures for him or white, because that was so pervasive. He didn't
Mhm.
need to see that.
Right.
He needed to see, Black role models.
Absolutely. And I did something similar to what you did too, especially, I like Disney movies. And so what I did was I made sure, we're going to watch Lion King and,
Yeah,
the ones with the animals, because the last thing
yeah.
I wanted, and, people they don't get to see necessarily the identity formation taking hold, and having your son and your child feel like, oh, all princes and all are white, and everyone who achieves this can only be white. And the impact it has on you, and the internalization part, if we're internalizing that, you know, but the flip side is protecting him from not seeing that. I get to see, how confident he is, right? And how comfortable he is with himself, but of course, it brings a lot of concerns, right? Because people frown upon, a Black kid that's comfortable, that's confident, that's outgoing, doesn't have hangups, right? People, people a lot of times, especially for kids, kids on the playground and, the way they're interacting with him are expected to be a little bit more, what's the word? I don't know if I want to use the word subservient or submissive type of,
Accommodating, maybe, for,
accommodating. There you
you
go.
know? Yeah, 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 yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Accommodating.
We can't raise our children like that.
Mm-mm.
We can't. We can't let them think that they always have to take a step back in order to make those that are in the majority and who have all of the power to make them feel comfortable and okay.
Right.
They need to feel uncomfortable sometimes. And I think that's like a big issue now, with
Yeah,
all this pushback.
absolutely.
Learning about Black history makes white children uncomfortable. It needs to make them uncomfortable so
Mm.
that they realize this should never happen again, because
Yeah.
this was really bad.
Mhm.
We're not doing them any favors, but yeah, yeah. We can't place that on our children. So, yeah.
I think the unfortunate thing is people don't really connect that with building character, right? In other words, facing the truth and reality. It takes character to do that. And that go ahead.
Now, black children are expected to have that character, right? They're
Yes.
expected to to
Mm-hmm.
take it.
Bear that burden. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
But most of the time, we don't see the connection between making sure all children know the truth so that history don't repeat itself. But it's interesting though. I think, yeah, well, I have a
So
lot of.
how old is your son now, if you share that? Uh,
He's 12 now.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, mine is now 47, 48 soon. Be interesting to see, to talk to you 20 years from now or so, to see, how it
Yeah.
all turned out. And
It will be interesting.
because I mean, 12 years he's probably entering the toughest phase of anyone's life,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those preteen to 12 to 15, where you're learning who you are and you're just miserable with yourself and the world anyway. And then all of that on top,
Yeah.
right? That's a lot.
Yeah. Well, he's been lucky, I think, we've really been conscious about the decision making for him because I felt like I've really strove to put him in schools with different cultures
Hmm.
because I felt like sometimes, in schools where there are extremes in thinking, and a lot of the schools, especially the top schools where we were just predominantly white schools. And I just did not yes, I wanted him to be in those honors classes, but I felt like I didn't want it to be at a cost of his identity. And so he's been fortunate. I've been able to see in those environments, who he aligned with in terms of his friendships. Where he is, I think it's probably the best place he's been in terms of, children that it's funny, like, how do I say this without, like, giving too much detail? He's with children who are predominantly, Asian families, foreign families, families where I used to teach at a school where kids were from all over. And one of the things I've observed, and so far that's been his experience, that those kids who come from all over, they're very kind to each other
Hmm.
because they're all in some ways trying to fit in, trying to fit into that culture. So it's been nice having him in a similar environment where he has kids from all these different backgrounds and who have a different history. Like, that was important to me because I've always looked at, the habits they build. These are parents who are also on top of their kids to focus as well, but it's not a predominantly white school. And that was really important to me as far as identity building and as far as just embracing kids that looked a little bit more like him.
Yeah, you're fortunate to have where you live to have like a variety of choices of schools.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true.
I didn't have that here. There was like for the elementary school, it was because they happened to have that they called it the lab school. It was supposed to be to train the teachers at Hampton University. They
Mhm,
had the lab school on campus, so that was just like really, really lucky. But
mhm,
after that,
yeah.
they stopped after fifth or sixth grade. There was public school, and that was what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. Wow. I'm curious, what type, if you can remember at all, what type of conversations you've had to have, even with other adults, whether it's, other mothers, husband, any of the above, to help them understand or even to make sense of what's going on in your world.
Mostly, I recall having those conversations with the teachers,
Mm,
not so much with other parents.
okay.
Yeah, I felt like I'm trying to think back of some instances, but sort of most of the kids my son hung out with in public school were the Black kids, and the Black community was just always overall, whether it was in school or family or
Okay.
people at work, much more accepting of me, of a mixed race child, than the white community was.
Okay, that makes sense.
So we just sort of always navigated, and my son did as well, to that
Mhm.
environment to where we really never had to have those conversations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the same was in the family. So we didn't openly like have discussions about how to raise him.
Mhm.
We just sort of made that decision at the very beginning, and that was the end of that discussion. Really, it just worked out really well.
That makes sense, that
Learned a
makes a
lot of
lot of
Black
sense.
history and Black culture along
Mhm.
the way, and realized, how naive I was when I moved to this country and how little
Mhm.
I knew. So, yeah, that was good for me too.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I guess it's same thing with me in terms of navigating. You put yourself in situations that are welcoming, so you don't have to
Mhm.
have those conversations. So that makes a lot of sense.
And I wonder if I ever thought about that, or if that's just sort of the natural instinct for
Mhm.
you to do, right?
Right.
Because you
Well,
don't want to
also
live your life in conflict, and
right.
at least I don't.
Yeah, neither do I. But yeah, it makes sense being also in an HBCU setting. You naturally seek out those resources. And since you had made a decision too to bring him up and make sure he has the Black identity, um, and that.
Yeah, and I have to say, Hampton University for many years was instrumental in that regard, because even when he went to public school, he would spend the summers on campus in some
Mhm,
kind of camp, or working, or doing something, later being a camp counselor.
mhm.
Even later on, when he was in college, he would come home in the summer and work with me. I had a lot of summer programs
Okay.
every summer, from like middle school kids on up to PhD students. So he always come and work with me in the summer and work with the younger kids. So yeah, that I think that experience shaped him in a way too, because even though he went on one path professionally, he changed, got a PhD in education, and is now working with HBCU faculty. So somehow that experience must have stuck with him.
Yeah.
It was sort of like coming full circle.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting when I think about, what you said earlier in terms of being blatant. Things are so subtle these days that it's almost, I don't want to say it's worse. It's just more pervasive
Hmm.
because when things are blatant, it's easier to show people, what they're doing wrong. But I am concerned about, the continuing projections of the past in subtle ways. Let me give you an example. One of the things I will be talking more and more about, I'm probably even doing a whole episode on it, is just I'm thinking of technology. I'm thinking of the pervasiveness and how they construct AI even,
Hmm.
right? And how even when people get into AI, that AI can be used as a mask to push certain ideas, push certain images, making people believe and even want a preference for looking differently, right? Like if you can create it and imagine it, make people think that, oh, this is your idea, this is your preference. When, it's something that's been projected, right? It can give a false openness about acceptance, which is a concern that I have, and so one of the things I try to tackle and think about quite a bit is, you know, what is important for our children to know? That's one thing I keep asking myself over and over again. What is important for them to know without being and be aware of without it necessarily impacting their identity or their self concept?
Yeah. So in some ways, that's the challenge now.
Hmm.
When my son grew up, it was a different challenge. Yeah, and I even see that. My son has two teenage daughters.
Hmm.
How social media and AI can easily influence their thinking and development. I'm sort of glad I'm not the parent of a small child these days. It wasn't easy then, but now,
Now you need like a whole, I don't know, more than a psychology degree and more, to
yeah, you
figure out
do.
what's happening with them, you know.
Yeah.
So let me see if there are any. Yeah, so now you need more, which is kind of scary. Well, do you have any questions for me, or any other thing you want to, any other issues,
I don't
challenges?
really have a question. It was just sort of an observation when I first met you. It was you wanted to incorporate the science in everyday life of the Gullah people
Mm-hmm.
into the science curriculum, sort of the science that your ancestors
Yeah.
knew and still know without it being called science.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was really, because I was always interested in that. That was just really, really cool. And
Nice.
now I'm sort of learning your motivation for that. And that's for me too, sort of coming full circle to,
Yeah.
to understand that. So yeah, it's a really cool thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. I mean, I've always appreciated your support. I just you know, the opportunity, even with that funding, to actually go and to collect the data I needed, you know, is really what helped push this.
Yeah.
So thank you. I would love to, I guess after this we'll talk, maybe we could do it HBCU.
Yes, we should. Yes, we should
I
talk
know we
about,
talked about it.
because I think that's becoming more important again,
Mm-hmm.
in the last, we can either say 5 months or 5 years, depending on, I mean, actually 9 years now. I think sort of during the Obama presidencies, people were questioning, why do we still need institutions like HBCUs that educate primarily Black students? Their time has passed. We're in this post-racial world. We don't need that now. And then, woo, like overnight, HBCUs were seen again sort of as, those are the institutions that can save our Black children in terms of providing an education for them. And yes, I'd love to talk about that, because it's a small
Absolutely.
number of institutions that can't do it all, and certainly not with the little bit of funding they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
But they're at the forefront of discussion again, and I haven't heard much talk about why they should be abolished lately.
Yeah, well, it's gosh, where do I begin? I mean, it's the reason I wrote my book on Black representation in science curriculum.
Hmm.
It's the reason I entered into academia. Right around that time Obama was president, I started seeing, um, for example, if someone had asked me that question alone would indicate to me the fact that you're actually asking that tells me we really need it. Uh,
Hmm. Right, 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 right.
because no one says, why do you need, the
Ivy
99,
League.
98% historically white universities, right? No one says that they've outlasted their time in having historically white universities that push the same agenda for years, right? Since they were established, since their conception. But I see it comes out constantly in our work. It comes out in the fact that we're always being asked to be the ones to show that something is true, or to show data for things. I think everyone needs to show data, okay? But a lot of times we're asked to justify things that if you just substitute the word black for white, wouldn't be asked to
Right.
choose, right? And so the very nature of those things, the very nature of those questions is what led me down the road. And the very nature of, and I'm talking about even before it became explicit. You and I had this conversation. Briefly we said, you had mentioned you didn't see it coming, right? And it was the opposite for me, right? I saw it coming. And mostly because of the type of pushback I was getting, you know? And And I know a lot of people were surprised by it, but in my heart of heart, I felt like I was preparing for it.
Mm.
I didn't necessarily know that was going to be now. I can't say. But what I did know is that because of what lay beneath, things would have to get worse before they get better. And that's how I'm continuing. I've revealed some of the way I'm continuing to think on my podcast. I've revealed some of it, some of the ideas and theories and explanations for why, what lay beneath, right? That people weren't really addressing or thinking about and why it lay beneath.
Maybe we can have that next conversation then.
Sounds good.
Be happy to do that.
Let
Well,
me,
thank you.
so
I was a little, as you know, a little bit hesitant talking about this topic, not because I'm hesitant to
right.
talk, but I didn't think I knew enough about the topic. I mean, I have a sample size of one, right? I raised one child and
And
he turned
most
out okay. And for those of us with, more scientific minds, we're like, that doesn't entitle you to talk about the subject at all.
Well, this is how I think of it. Most people have a sample size of 0. And my sample size is just very, nuanced. I feel like being put in a position where you're in a mixed family helps you to understand some nuances, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
nuances
yeah.
that things you have to be explicit about or things you have to consider and the why. And I think it's also why we need HBCUs. We need to make sure children are grounded in a way that they have a future later on, because I think their future has always been um what's the word? Almost hanging by a string, right? It's always been that way. Even when people were in a different mindset of, no, it's not that way. One of the things, focusing on Black representation also helped show me that things hadn't changed because I was purposely pushing the envelope by talking about Black representation. And so it helped reveal that even these quote unquote advocates didn't feel the way that sometimes they were saying, you know. But so I'm gonna end here unless you have any last minute things that you want to
We could have a whole conversation though around advocates,
around what?
and what they are and are not. I'm just kidding.
No, we can.
I'm just kidding. Let's
I
not go there.
I know, I know, I know. It's the which is very double-sided too, people don't realize
Yeah,
that. But
yeah.
well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me on this, podcast. And if you like this podcast, please like and follow and look out for the next podcast. Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation.